Okay, so let's see if we can't wrap up this material from last week quickly. So, big issues from the lecture. This is all review. We're looking at religion as a worldview, and I'm going to introduce concepts like the sacred, ritual and ritualization, and rites of passage. We've talked last week about how religion is actually really hard to define anthropologically, and there's not a really good way of defining the distinction between religious and not religious, or religious and secular or mundane. However, when we look at religion, it gives us a great entry point into a number of other issues, from, as we talked about, social evolutionary ideologies that continue to persist today, as well as issues in terms of how religion intersects with things like economic or political systems. And so this is one of the really big issues for this week. Again, still on review. Religion gives us a sense of an entry point into questions of worldview, people's view of the world. And specifically looking at the symbols and stories that people use to interpret and make sense of the world around them. We're also less concerned with sacred texts than how people actually practice religion. We're not interested in the quote-unquote proper way of practicing Christianity. We're not concerned with theological arguments as much as we are concerned with things like how Matt Ray talks about the ways in which specific formulations of fundamentalist Christianity in the 1970s reflects larger global anxieties about the global economic shifts. Excuse me. Social evolutionism gives us we've already critiqued this in previous classes, but it does a very good job of articulating why the definition of religion doesn't make that much sense anthropologically, and why it doesn't actually help us, and why it's so hard to think about the difference, why it doesn't even make sense to create this dichotomy between religious and non-religious aspects of social life. So one of the main conceptual tools that anthropologists have for thinking through quote-unquote religion is this idea of the sacred. Now, what's funny about the sacred is it's actually not contained within religion. Even in quote-unquote non-religious contexts, the sacred remains an important part of social life. But basically what the sacred is, from an anthropological perspective, is it's a symbol. It's an organizing symbol at the heart of a cultural system. It's that thing that really matters. It's that heavy thing that exercises a kind of gravitational pull that warps society around it. So, as anthropologists, we have a technique. We know how to find the sacred because it's always surrounded by negative rituals or taboos, limitations, prescriptions about what you can't do. If these negative rituals or taboos surround the sacred like barbed wire. But once you get past that barbed wire, you enter into this realm of positive rituals or celebrations. And so basically what we're doing as anthropologists is we're looking for these taboos that once you cross, you get into these spaces of celebration. And when we find that, we say, oh, okay, this is something that really matters to the people I'm working with. This is something I should pay attention to because it's going to tell me something important. It's going to be at the heart of the worldview. So one example I give for the sacred is a synagogue. Now, what's really sacred in the synagogue is the Torah. And the Torah is surrounded by all of these barriers or negative rituals. The Torah is covered in a cloth, a physical separation from Torah and the rest of the world. The Torah is kept in an ark, which is kept closed, a further layer of physical separation. The ark is kept within a prayer room, which has walls from the rest of the synagogue, and then the synagogue is a building separated from the rest of the building. So you have, these layers of walls, these layers of barriers surrounding and protecting the sacred. It doesn't stop there, right? When you open the ark in services, Everyone has to stand. It's taboo to sit when the ark is open. And the Torah is carried around by someone who never touches the Torah, but only touches the coverings, right? The coverings, that person then walks through the synagogue, and you're not allowed to touch the Torah. That's taboo. What you can do is you can touch your prayer book to the Torah, or you can touch your shawl to the Torah, and then touch that to your lips. If someone drops the Torah, that's a big fucking deal. At that point, the Torah needs to be retired. And there's a whole ritual process for how to properly dispose of a Torah. You can't just throw it in the trash. When it's done being walked around, when it's done literally being paraded through the synagogue, through the service room for people to see, it's put on a book and a person reads from it. They don't touch it, but they have a special kind of stick, I guess you'd call it, like a pokey thing, and you use it to, it's long, and you use it to kind of hold your place as you read through it. The way sometimes people read and hold their place with their finger. When the Torah is put back up, you stand while it's put back in its clothing, what do you call that, coverings, and then put back in the Torah, and you sit down, in the ark, and you sit down when the ark is closed. So this is the sacred, right? These are the taboos and celebrations that tell us, okay, whatever the Torah is, it's really important in this cultural framework. Now, the funny thing about the concept of the sacred, as I said earlier, is that it's not limited to just what we would consider religious phenomenon. One of my favorite examples for the sacred is money. And so what I've done in previous classes, and you can't see me here so I won't do it, but what I've done in previous classes to teach this concept is I hold up a dollar bill and I say, this is just a piece of paper. And then I rip it up. And when I rip it up, students all gasp and they go, ah! I've broken a taboo here, right? A taboo. Sorry, I can't say that word. I've broken a taboo by ripping up the money. I have committed sacrilege. And when I do this, I feel this rush of power go through me, like real fucking visceral power. And I get a little manic because I'm just so overwhelmed by this, it's almost a release of power that flows through me. But this is what the sacred is, right? The sacred are those things that we invest with value. In this case, literally economic value. To distinguish them from, for example, any other literal piece of paper. So, when I say that money is sacred in an anthropological sense, I'm not making some blasé statement about capitalism or whatever. I mean I am, but it's just not blasé. When I say that money is your god, I'm kind of serious about it, right? Money's not literally your god, but money is literally a sacred object. And we imbue it with this sacred value through these negative rituals and positive rituals. Y'all are probably too young to remember the game shows where they put you in a tube with wind blowing everywhere and they throw money into it and you try to grab all the money you can before the timer goes off. Game shows are perfect money rituals, positive rituals. Treating yourself is a positive ritual around money. Anyway, money is a good example of the sacred. So are flags. The American flag is not supposed to touch the ground. There's tons of taboos. It's not supposed to touch the ground. If it touches the ground, it's supposed to be disposed of in a certain way through this ritual practice of burning. And it's not supposed to be turned into clothing, but people do that anyway. But that's okay, because that's just not the way they express their view of the sacred, and it's fine for the way we articulate taboos to change over hundreds of years. That's just society. Anyway, the point is there are all of these taboos that are all, once you get past that barbed wire of taboos, you get into this realm of celebrations. Things like Independence Day, right? Celebrations around the flag. So that's the sacred. The sacred is what's really heavy. It's those things that we invest in heavy cultural value through this process of setting them apart, through this work of taboos, through this work of celebration. It's those things we set apart from the mundane world. And yet, it does not give us a framework for defining religion. We're just left with a worldview. Which is why, if we talk about things like what we would call religious expressions worldwide, what we talked about last week in terms of animism, or some people will call paganism, sure, why not? What we're talking about here are not really religions in a Eurocentric sense. They are definitely worldviews, but they're not really religions any more than worshiping money as a religion, which is to say, maybe, sure, I don't know. So the second framework that I want to introduce is rituals and ritualization. Rituals are transformative and transportative. They change you. They transport you to other places, symbolically, not necessarily literally. So when we talk about rituals, we can talk about communion. That is a ritual. We can talk about gender as a kind of, not a spiritual ritual, but in the same way we talked in a previous class about gender as a performance that you do again and again until it congeals into the illusion of something stable. That's ritual, right? That is this stereotyped repetitive behavior. It's ritualization. And it creates, it transforms you as a social being. And it creates you. It has real social power. Weddings are rituals. There's a moment when you say I do, and by uttering these magic words, suddenly you have entered into a new legal and social status, which is married, which is a different kind of position to inhabit within the social structure. Bar mitzvahs are transformative. You're transformed from a child into an adult. But we can also talk about ritualization, which is the process by which things that we wouldn't necessarily recognize as spiritual get ritualized. So I have a link for you in here, from this film called Trobriand Cricket. And watch a little bit of it. Watch the first couple minutes and watch around 16:12. I was going to show you this in class, but it doesn't work. But that didn't work out. But what you'll see in this video is this extremely ritualized practice of playing cricket in the Trobriand Islands. And it's Trobriand cricket in the Trobriand Islands is different than cricket in England. It's practiced differently. For example, it's not important to have teams of equal numbers of players. It's not important to limit the amount of players on any team. Like, there's no set number. And the reason for that is because cricket was originally introduced as an alternative to war practices between villages. And so instead of going to war, you play cricket. And just like war, no one's counting how many people are on your team. Having more people is a strength sometimes. So, what you see, right, is this process through which cricket gets ritualized in multiple ways. On the one hand, there are these dances that people perform. Cheers! There's a team called the Airplanes, and they have cheers that they do that involve them dancing around like airplanes. And this is a reference to a military base near their village. There is a team called the PKs, which is a reference to a brand of bubble gum. And they have a chant about how their hands are so sticky they're going to catch the ball. There's a lot of sexual innuendo. There's And then, of course, there's also spiritual specialists who participate in who do magic in order to positively affect the results of the game for their team. And so you have these dueling spiritual specialists on each team throughout the game. So you have this game that is not inherently ritual, that is not inherently religious, but it gets ritualized. And that's an important social process. Now, it's not that different than the way cricket is ritualized in Britain or baseball is ritualized in the United States. You know, baseball players have tons of magical invocations. You hit the ball, you like tap the bat to the ground 2 times and spit and kiss your hand or something, and that's gonna like give you better chances of whatever. I don't know what baseball is. Anyway, the point is, baseball in the United States is likewise surrounded by all of these ritualized processes. It's easier to see in Turbin because we don't take it for granted, but we do it here too. Now, because ritualization and rituals don't fit into this neat religion-non-religion binary, we can point to many of these examples, many different examples. We can look at communion in these pictures I've got for you. I got you some fucking Wicca shit, all kinds of fun rituals, and I have you a courtroom. Going to court is the most fucking ritualized fucking process I can imagine. You know, like there's a part where you put your hand on a book and you say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God, or whatever it is the fuck you say if you don't believe in God. And that is a ritual that is meant to elicit truth-telling, in which what you say enters into this documentary record as law. And you have people in fucking funny robes who are like handing you sentences. And if they tell you, you gotta go and be incarcerated for 10 years, that's the reality because they fucking said so. In the same way, once you say I do in a wedding, that makes it real. So too does the judge handing out the sentence make it real. That's what ritual does. It makes shit real. And there's a specific kind of ritual that anthropologists love talking about, which is rites of passage. A rite of passage is basically when you are transformed from one social category to another. So bar and bat mitzvahs are rites of passages. It's a ritual that you go through in which you are transformed from a child to an adult. Boot camp is a rite of passage. You are transformed from an everyday citizen into a soldier. There's tons more. I just have to think about it a little bit. But basically, with these rites of passages... Oh, I'm sorry. College is a fucking rite of passage. Again, you're being transformed from a child into like something like an adult. I don't know. They tell you you're an adult when you're done or something. And we have all these funny languages for talking about the college experience that like imply like, oh, it's different from the real world. Like, there's something about being in college that's different from the real world of capitalist exploitation. Not that y'all aren't being exploited, too, but, you know, whatever. Which is a funny statement, right? Because, like, I am very deeply confused by how possibly this whole set of institutions and buildings, and y'all listening to me talk right now, is somehow not real, like it's imaginary. But maybe I'm just making it all up, and it's all in my head, and none of it is real. That's a joke. I understand what people mean by not real, but this is actually pointing to it as being a rite of passage. I'll get to this later, but a liminal stage between categories. So, a rite of passage is about transforming people from one social category into another social category. Rites of passage can be divided into 3 stages: a beginning, a middle, and an end. But it's actually a little more interesting than that. The first stage is separation. Before you go into a rite of passage, you are separated from the rest of society. You are separated from your previous identity. You are stripped of it. In a lot of societies, you might be stripped of clothes. In boot camp, you have your hair buzzed, right? You are stripped of your identity. And as you enter into this separation stage. Then there's a transition stage which is this kind of liminal moment of being in transition, right? When you're in a liminal stage, you are betwixt and between categories. You are neither one nor the other. Liminality is a super interesting thing to think about anthropologically. It's important in ritual, it's important in gender, it's important in all kinds of things. Being liminal is being betwixt and between. And it is a fucking weird place to be that does weird shit to our understanding of society. I got distracted thinking about stuff. Excuse me. So you have this liminal period where you're neither one thing nor the other, but somewhere in between. And in the third stage, you're incorporated back into the social world. Let's talk about graduation, for example. You go into graduation, you all wear your weird robes, which, by the way, is a medieval fucking practice that's because academia is not a capitalist mode of production. It's a guild system. And so, because it's this old fucking guild system, we wear these medieval robes and shit. Anyway, like, y'all are fucking apprentices. You are not, like, capitalist workers in relation to the university. You are apprentices. And that's a different kind of exploitation. Anyway, you go through, you march, you do the whatever they do in the ritual. You're in between, and then you get your degree, and you get reincorporated back as a graduate. So you're moving between social categories, and these social categories really matter, right? These are categories that shape how you relate to other people in the social world. In very real ways. Another aspect of that transition stage is, well, actually, let me come back to that. Another way of thinking about this is the interplay between what is called structure and anti-structure. So what's structure? Structure is both social and symbolic structure. It is the social differences and hierarchies that we inhabit, the difference between the social structure of child versus adult, citizen versus military, whatever the fuck they're called, soldiers, whatever fucking other categories you have for whatever rite of passage. Living versus dead, funerals are another rite of passage. Living people versus dead people. You have to be transformed into a properly dead person through a funeral, so that people know how to relate, so that people can relate to you as a dead person. You literally shift positions in people's eyes. That's what these are about. Anyway, those are social structures. In the sense that they are both, they're social structures and they're symbolic structures, in that they are categorical oppositions between cultural concepts. Child versus adult. These are cultural categories. They are cultural oppositions. So we normally, in our everyday lives, live in a world of structure, of social structure and symbolic structure. The funny thing about rites of passage, and this is the circular circular diagram in the slide. A rite of passage is interesting because you go from this position of structure, what in the diagram they call identity, who you are as a person. And as you're separated out, you enter into this realm of anti-structure. So when you're in this liminal stage, when you're betwixt and between categories, all of those categories fall apart. And you're in this space of anti-structure, of structurelessness, that is like really kind of fucking weird in a lot of ways. One of the ways people talk about this is in those spaces of anti-structure, you have what's called communitas. Communitas is collective joy experienced in these liminal moments. And the thing about communitas is it's premised on the dissolution of boundaries between you and other people. Communitas is about dissolving boundaries and the kind of joys that we experience in those spaces of dissolved boundaries, of the dissolution of ourselves, of our egos, of our social structures. This is when in certain churches people start speaking in tongues. This is when, and this is, it creates this kind of dynamic, right? Anyway, I'll come back. Never mind, that's too far out there. So anyway, there's this moment of anti-structure, but you have to return from the anti-structure. You have to reconstitute the social structures and the symbolic structures in order to reincorporate and reconstitute them, where now you are an adult. So it's this really funny dynamic because it's easy to think about a rite of passage as a person transforming from one category to the other. But really what's happening on a symbolic level here is it's not the person that's being transformed. It's that the entire symbolic structure and social structure is being dissolved temporarily in order to be reconstituted with people in different places after the fact. So yeah, this is fucking weird shit. Now you can also think of a lot of forms of liminality that are not about these things at all, right? Like, what does it mean to be liminal in the context of the gender binary? And what does that position of liminality, what kind of perspective does that anti-structural perspective grant you? Queer politics, here's another gender sexuality example. Queer politics is all about liminality and anti-structure. And by queer politics, I mean the politics of disrupting dominant heteronormative categories. Dissolving these binaries wherever, as if the world consists of these discrete identities and creating an alternative. Anti-structure is a creative space. That said, anti-structure usually gives way, almost always, maybe does always give way back to structure. So it's always a back and forth. It's always an interplay. The dissolution of structure always gets reconstituted. And yet, that structure always gets dissolved. So, and as you've gathered, right, again, rites of passage, we're actually not talking about purely what we would call religious phenomenon. I have no basis for distinguishing religion versus not religion, but I can talk about ritual and ritualization, and I can tell you about rites of passage. But, this framework is just as powerful as an explanatory framework if we're talking about queer politics, if we're talking about bar mitzvahs, or if we're talking about boot camp. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, I'm going to shift gears and introduce the very first part of the book. That we're starting to read. I'm not going to go deep into it because of sake of time, but I would encourage you not to fall behind in this process because if you fall behind, you'll end up having to do more readings at once. I've figured it out so that you have to read, on average, 40 pages each class, and we'll finish the book. If you fall behind, you're going to have days where you're reading 60 pages or something like that. That said, for the discussion questions, I want to focus on the religion segment of the course, and then I'm going to postpone the questions about the first 40 pages of the book until Thursday. So, we're going to begin with that. Let's begin Jason De Leon's book, The Land of Open Graves. This book is our second ethnography, the second full-length, book-length ethnography that we're reading as an example of ethnographic research and anthropological research, and what this approach has to contribute to the social sciences. One of the things that I think is really great about this book as an introductory text is what it does, the way it draws on the four fields of anthropology. Jason De Leon is working out how these four fields matter in contemporary anthropology, and making an argument that they still do. So just to review that material really quickly, because we covered this a long time ago in the class. The four fields of anthropology consist of cultural anthropology, sociolinguistics, archaeology, and physical anthropology. This is a framework that emerges out of Boasian anthropology in the Americas in the early 21st century. You may remember Boas for his wacky portraits of him doing weird shit, or for his contributes to anti-racist thought in the early 20th century, not 21st century. And the idea is that through these four subfields, the goal is to study the whole of human life, past and present, past and cultural and physical. Now, what Jason DeLeon is he takes this framework and he updates it through the concerns that we've been discussing in contemporary anthropology over the last several weeks, this concern for structural violence. So can four-field anthropology help us grapple with problems of structural violence? So here's what Jason DeLeon is doing in his book, in his approach to four-field anthropology. Different chapters are going to draw on different frameworks. There will be chapters that draw on ethnography, on sociolinguistics, on biological anthropology, and archaeology. And he's going to draw on these different approaches in order to deeper understand the lives and deaths of migrant people on the southern border. So what Jason DeLeon is doing is he's taking this four-field approach and he's placing a critique of power and structural violence at the center of analysis. He's taking this framework that emerges in the early 20th century and updating it with these contemporary concerns for power and violence. And as he does that, he's asking, how do these different approaches provide different questions or lenses or tools for investigating border violence? And finally, how do these approaches help him make invisible forms of violence and trauma visible? That's what the book is about. That's why I'm assigning it. This is where I'm going to start next class on Thursday. But for just to kind of say this briefly, one of the main interventions or arguments that Jason DeLeon is making here is that part of how border violence works is that the United States government is able to mobilize and weaponize entire landscapes to enact violence on migrants. Basically, the Border Patrol creates situations where migrant people have to put themselves at severe risk for dying in the desert. And that kind of violence is often rendered invisible because, first of all, the bodies of migrants disappear in the desert, and second of all, because the government, the Border Patrol, can say, we didn't kill them. We're not committing violence. They went through a dangerous environment and died. But what gets lost in this is the understanding of the larger system of policy, the larger political and policy basis, which creates these systematic conditions in which people are doing this kind of dangerous behavior, in which the only way for people to cross is in these extremely dangerous ways, and the ways in which the government takes advantage of desert landscapes in order to enact violence on migrants' bodies. And so Jason DeLeon writes, the terrible things that migrating parents experience en route are neither random nor senseless, but part of a strategic federal plan that has rarely been publicly illuminated and exposed for what it is, a killing machine that simultaneously uses and hides behind the viciousness of the Sonoran Desert. And there are multiple ways in which this structural violence gets disguised. There's these sterilized discourses, the framing of, you'll read that in the book, or you have read that in the book, redirecting blame, we're not doing violence, it's the desert, and relying on these natural environmental processes, such as the decomposition of the corpse, which happens very rapidly in the desert, in order to hide the evidence of death. Through these processes, let me start over with that sentence. So basically, right, what this book does that's at this point in the semester is it draws together multiple themes from this course. We're going to be talking about the four fields of anthropology. We're going to be talking about structural violence. And we're going to be talking about human-non-human relationships. How are non-human beings and landscapes enrolled into systems of structural violence by the government, by the Border Patrol? So with that, as I said earlier, I'm going to have y'all discuss this book in class on Thursday. For today, I want y'all's discussion to focus on the segment on religion and worldview. Alright, and I'll see you guys later this week. Alright, here's some discussion questions. Go ahead and work through these in the, discussion form, asynchronous discussion form. And if there are other things that you want to talk about from the readings that really sparked your imagination, or the lecture that really sparked your imagination, go for it. This is a structure. Do the anti-structure if you want. Some people like structure. Some people that helps them. But if you want the anti-structure, go for it. I don't pretend to be able to anticipate every interesting question or thought that you may come up with through the course of this class.